Okay, I'll jump right in. What do evolutionists say is the reason that animals are no longer evolving? If that's a true statement, I didn't know that was a true statement, if it is or isn't. And why did the evolutionary process stop in that way?
Do you want to
Go ahead.
Well, I'll let Hugh jump in here because he has a real interesting take on this. But the way I look at evolution is I'm a skeptic of the evolutionary paradigm, but I recognize that there's some aspects of biological evolution that actually are well evidenced. Microevolution, speciation. Microevolution, the textbook example would be a peppered moth changing its wing color from light to dark. This is, again, an example of adaptation or microevolution or speciation, the emergence of the Galapagos finches from one bird species to closely related sister species. This is well evidenced. And so, in a sense, we see speciation and microevolution at work. We see bacteria evolving as well. But in terms of large-scale innovation, we don't see any of that happening at this point in time. In fact, I would argue that large-scale innovation is something that I question whether there's actually robust evidence for. Macroevolution, I question, obviously, chemical evolution and the origin of life. So I think we do see microevolution and speciation, but that's the limit of what we see.
Yeah, and where we do see the microevolution is where you've got a species with an extremely high population, a short generation time where they go from birth to being able to reproduce in weeks or less, where they don't have complex biochemistry. And yet when you look at the fossil record, we see that there's lots of, quote, transitional forms for whales. And whales have a very low population, a huge body size, very long time between being born and being able to give birth. They should be at the bottom, and yet we see them at the top. And yet there's field studies that show that whenever you're talking about a mammal, if a mammal has an adult body size bigger than 7 pounds, it will go extinct before it can experience any significant evolution. But Buzz is right. We're talking bacteria, we're talking insects, certain plant species. We do see it. But if you look at the textbooks for evolution, they're saying our evidence is that these very large animals, that's exactly where we see the greatest problems. And you say, well, why do we see all these, quote, transitions for whales? God likes whales. Moreover, we've written in our book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, that the reason why you see all these different species of whales, you need those different species showing at just the right time and just the right locations on Earth in order to help compensate for the brightening of the sun. That's the one thing evolutionary biologists often fail to take into account. We live in a regime where the sun gets brighter and brighter. Therefore, it's necessary for the Creator to step in with different life forms at different times in order to compensate for the brightening of the sun. And only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun will know which life needs to be on the Earth at which time. You'll see that described in great detail in Improbable Planet. And that may be a way we can resolve this. If we can just get the biologists to look at astrophysics of the sun, maybe we can get this all settled.
All right, so you guys use a lot of big words that I couldn't really understand. I just got a simple question. So is a human mind considered a galaxy?
Can what?
Is a human mind considered a galaxy?
Can the human mind consider the galaxy? Is that your question?
Is the human mind considered a galaxy?
Oh, is the human mind considered a galaxy? No. Stars and galaxies are incredibly simple. They're made up predominantly of just hydrogen and helium gas, and your brain is a lot more complicated than a bag of helium and hydrogen gas.
You actually, the human brain has 85 billion neurons that make it up. It's mind-boggling in terms of complexity. So yeah, the human brain is incredible in terms of its complexity, and we don't even understand even the beginnings of how our brains and our minds work.
Hi, my question is about Neanderthals. when you said it was proven, of course, that Neanderthals were here first. How does that correlate, or how do you explain that as far as like with the Bible, and the Bible saying, Adam and Eve were first, and it seemed like, from what I've read or know of the Bible, that they seem pretty human. So how do you feel that kind of fits in?
Yeah. Well, when you look at the Genesis 1 creation account, which is giving you an overview of Earth's history and life's history, the way I look at it is each day of creation is like a snapshot of what God has done, where there's a lot of information that's left out about God's creative work. And so I think the emphasis ultimately is preparing the planet for human beings to be created, who are the crown of creation. But there's a lot of information about life's history that's left out. So I would argue that the Bible is essentially silent on the existence of Neanderthals or any of the other hominids like Lucy or Homo erectus. And in fact, we've only known about these creatures for probably just a little bit over 100 years, maybe 125 years. So for most of human history, we're completely oblivious to the fact that these creatures existed. But as we study them, the way I look at them is that these are not transitional forms, but rather creatures that God created that existed and went extinct, that they had intelligence and emotional capabilities like all animals do, but they lacked the image of God. And so I see Neanderthals in the same vein that I would see chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas. Fascinating, remarkable creatures in their own right that reflect God's glory, but they lacked the image of God. And they did employ tools, but we have evidence that chimpanzees employ tools. And in fact, what we see Neanderthals doing is looking a lot like what we see chimps doing in the wild. Not identical, but it's in a similar context. So I see Neanderthals as creatures that God made that went extinct. They lack the image of God. And the difference that we see in the behavioral capacities of humans and Neanderthals reflects that difference. The similarity, to me, isn't surprising because when I look at shared biological features that life on Earth has, I just look at those shared features as reflecting common design templates that a creator employed as he was creating life on Earth. And so we bear similarity to other creatures, but that similarity shouldn't be confused as evidence for our evolutionary history. I see it as evidence that we come from a single creator that employed common archetypes.
I got one here. Do you believe that God created Earth, humans, etc., in 6 days?
Yes, we do believe that it was done in 6 days, but it's 6 long periods of time. I've written a whole book, it's not here, but A Matter of Days, making the point that if you read the Bible literally and consistently, so all 66 books are saying the same thing, then the creation days in Genesis must be 6 consecutive long periods of time. And keep in mind, this is an English language controversy. When I speak overseas, where they're speaking with a much smaller vocabulary than we do in English, this isn't a controversy. The challenge is taking a very tiny vocabulary language like Hebrew and translating it into English, which is the biggest vocabulary language that has ever existed. So we look at the word day as referring to 24 hours, but the Hebrew word for day, yom, has 4 distinct literal definitions. Part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. And 3 of those definitions are used in the first page of the Bible. Creation day 1, it's contrasting days and nights. That's day for daylight hours. Creation day 4, it talks about seasons, days, and years. That's day as 24 hours. Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's a long period of time. And notice there's no evening and morning for the 7th day. And 3 texts, John 5, Hebrews 4, and Psalm 95 tell us we're still in God's 7th day. So at a minimum, the 7th day must be a long period of time.
Just real quick, say those references again, those scriptures.
What scriptures?
The ones that you just referenced.
Okay.
You ain't
Creation.
got to say them, just reference them again.
Okay, yeah, it's John 5,
John 5,
Psalm 95,
Psalm 95,
Hebrews 4,
Hebrews 4.
where in God's seventh day, it's a day when God doesn't create, but God focuses on his work of redemption. Which, interesting, it also explains why so many scientists say we see no scientific evidence for God. Of all they're looking at is the human era. That's the day when God stops his creation miracles. So if that's what the scientist is looking for, and he's looking for it on the human era, he will or she will not find it. It explains why so many astronomers are believers in God, because their data comes from deep time. Whereas with biologists, most of them are focusing during the human era, and therefore they say, we don't see the evidence. They're looking on the wrong days.
You opened this evening with a comment that 1/3 of Americans come from a STEM background or some type of scientific background or have an influence from that. Yet the narrative in our society seems to be that there is a conflict between faith and science. They cannot coexist. Yet you present a very different view. My question is this: what are your recommendations on how we can present this evidence for a creator to someone who comes from a STEM background? It seems to me that with this conflict in America between faith and science, that we seem to be speaking a different language from a different worldview. So how can we effectively communicate to someone who has a scientific background these facts in a way that they'll understand and
Yeah,
break
that's a
through?
really good question, and it's kind of our motivation for the message tonight. The reason why we have so many people in STEM careers or people who are influenced by STEM, thinking there's a conflict between science and the Christian faith, we Christians have not engaged them. They're an unreached people group, and if we target that unreached people group, I think this situation will go away. And so, yeah, and that's been our experience. As we engage people in these STEM careers, they change from thinking that science contradicts the Bible to recognizing that science indeed supports the Bible. Science and the Bible are allies, they're not enemies. But we need to get that message out, and the only way we're going to get it is by engaging these folks. The tendency of Christians is either to attack people in the STEM careers or to withdraw from them. The Bible tells us we're to engage. They're a mission field, let's engage them, because we know that they're just as hungry for Christ as the rest of the people groups here on the planet. They just need to be reached in a way that they can receive.
If I could add just one point real quickly. I think a lot of, and you made the comment about worldview, and I think that's really a very insightful point, because many times the conflict isn't with regard to the evidence or even what the implication of the evidence is. It really is different worldviews that are viewing that same evidence in very different ways. And so part of it is to know what the evidence is, and then how to make the connection between the evidence and the Christian worldview, and then also to highlight how that evidence actually fits uncomfortably within a more naturalistic or materialistic worldview. So it really becomes a combination of worldview thinking and science. And if you notice tonight that all of the evidences that we present, we're presenting scientific data that everybody would agree upon, but we are showing how that data is compatible with a Christian worldview, and that's a very critical component.
Hello. Quick question, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you had read this question and that you were just responding about the days in creation, because I apologize, I was talking to this young man. But my question is, where do you stand on the old Earth versus young Earth creation debate? I know that one of the points that old Earth proponents use is like, radioactive carbon dating, things like that. But so where do you guys stand on that debate?
Well, just to be clear, we are old Earth creationists.
Okay.
Although as I was sharing with your pastors over lunch, there was a debate about 60 years ago in the astronomical community. Is the universe young or is it old? but the debate was between quadrillions of years and billions of years. And the young universe astronomers won. It's only billions of years old. And if it's only billions, there really is no room for naturalistic evolution. You have to have a God that's involved in all this. And if you read the history of that astronomical debate, it was theology that was driving the debate. Those pushing for quadrillions of years wanted to keep God out of the picture, but hey, it's only billions of years. But yeah, we're old Earth creationists. And what was your first part of your question?
That was the first part.
Okay, and then what was the second part?
About radiometric dating.
Radiometric dating, yes. The Bible tells us in 7 places the laws of physics don't change. Jeremiah 33, where God compares his immutability, his unchangeable nature, and he says, just like the laws of physics don't change, I don't change. Here's what's significant. Every young Earth creationist model depends on radically altered laws of physics at the fall of Adam, the flood, or both. And they particularly need the radiometric decay rates to change by a factor of anywhere from 1 million to 1 billion times. Number one, the Bible rules that out. It says the constants don't change. Number two, in astronomy, we can look at distant stars and galaxies and measure the radiometric decay rates in those stars and galaxies. They measure to be identical to what we measure in the lab here today. And what's interesting about astronomy is the one science where we directly access the past. The other sciences infer the past, but in astronomy, we directly access it. And it's because of the velocity of light. So as I tell my wife that because I'm an astronomer, I cannot be held accountable for the present. All my data comes from the past. So when I look at the sun, I don't see the sun as it is now. I see the sun as it was 8¼ minutes ago. Or when I look at the Crab Nebula, I see it as it was 6,500 years ago. But by looking at these distant stars and galaxies, we can measure the constants of physics, we can measure the radiometric decay rates, and they're identical to what we measure here. So it confirms what the Bible stated thousands of years ago, but also tells us there's really no room for altered radiometric decay rates. Now, with respect to carbon-14, it has a half-life of 5,715 years, and like all radiometric decay dating tools, it is reliable within a factor of 6 of the half-life. So you can divide that 5,715 years by 6 or multiply it by 6. That's the range where it can give you accurate dates. Outside that range, it can't. And what you hear from young Earth creationists, they'll say, well, we have these samples that geophysicists insist are billions of years old, and they measure to be 58,000 years old by radiocarbon dating. Well, radiocarbon dating is basically looking at cosmic rays coming through the atmosphere and transforming nitrogen 15 into carbon 14. But that's not the only way you get carbon 14. There's uranium and thorium in the crust of the Earth. And likewise, there's nitrogen in the crust of the Earth. And the decay of uranium and thorium will transform a very tiny amount of that nitrogen into carbon 14. So no matter how old a sample is, it will have a date of 58,000 years. So anytime you see a carbon-14 date of 57, 58, 59,000 years, you know that's simply the background signal. That's not the actual carbon-14 date. The limit for carbon-14 is about 40,000 years. Older than that, you don't get a reliable date. If it's younger than 1,000 years, you won't get a reliable date. That was a problem with the Shroud of Turin. The carbon-14 was saying 1300, the 13th century AD. That's too young for carbon-14. It's great for early Bible manuscripts, which are about 2,000 years old. Those we can date to high precision with carbon-14. If you want the details, you'll find them in the book, The Crater and the Cosmos.
Man, I'm just glad smart people like you are believers. I got a question here, and then we'll go to Darius. What are some of the best points that your opponents have made in debate? Because both of you debate quite frequently, and I'm guessing people on opposite ends of what you believe. So what are some of the most challenging and best points that you both have engaged in debate?
Well, it depends what kind of person we're debating. Are you talking about an atheist scientist, a young earth creationist, an evolutionist? Or?
Let's go with the atheist scientist.
Okay, you want to start off, Buzz?
Yeah, well, when it comes to biology, probably the most challenging problem for the notion that there's a creator that's responsible for life would be so-called bad designs in nature. And the idea would be if there are bad designs or flawed designs in nature, that doesn't seem compatible with an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. But one of the things that's really interesting is many times when people point out what they would argue are bad designs in nature, these are typically very complex systems that we don't have full understanding of. And as we develop that understanding, what we thought was a bad design turns out to be an elegant design. And so the examples like the inverted retina of vertebrate eyes or wisdom teeth or the human appendix, these are classic examples, the panda's thumb. These have all been cited as examples of flawed designs that turn out to actually have good reasons why they are the way that they are. But the quintessential example would be junk DNA, the idea that within our genome, about 95% of our genetic makeup is comprised of non-functional DNA that people argued was the vestiges of an evolutionary history. And interestingly enough, we've discovered that virtually every class of junk DNA has function. And in fact, if you look at something called the ENCODE project, which was cataloging the functional elements in the human genome, it looks as if close to 80% of the human genome is functional, not 5%, as people thought initially when the human genome was sequenced. And the expectation is that number is even going to increase in terms of functionality as more work is done with the ENCODE project. So that would be an example of what I think to be the greatest challenge. I also think the problem of evil is always a problem. It's really a philosophical issue, but my experience when you present a case for a creator, one of the most common retorts is ultimately related to the problem of evil. And so I think as Christians, we need to make sure that we are equipped to engage the problem of evil. And in fact, tomorrow night at the church service, I'm going to address the problem of evil in a biological context. So.
Yeah, and come Sunday morning, I'm going to tell a story of sitting on an airplane for 2 hours with a German atheist quantum physicist. And he brought up what he considered to be the 8 big objections to the Christian faith. So I'll be telling the story of what happened during that 2-hour conversation. But one of those 8 objections was the problem of evil. And what you'll hear on Sunday morning is how I was able to appeal to him as a quantum physicist and say, do you realize every one of the laws of physics has been fine-tuned by our Creator to eliminate evil once and for all? And he said, well, you got to tell me about that. So.
How y'all doing? I just wanted to know what, if any, influence the Scopes trial had on either one of you.
Okay, the influence of the Scopes trial, I do write about that in the book A Matter of Days, the book that's not here, in the sense that I think that was a turning point in the Christian community where they felt beaten down by atheist scientists. And so that's when I saw happening in the Christian community kind of withdrawal from the scientific community. And that's why I think we have such a large unreached people group amongst these STEM individuals. And that's when I saw Christians too trying to strike out at these atheist scientists rather than engage them in a loving spirit. But I think it all stems back to the great embarrassment of what happened at that Scopes trial. And so that's something I think we're still trying to recover from. But again, the Bible tells us we need to engage our enemies with grace and with love and with humility. That's the way back.
Dr. Faz, you stated that biochemistry and science were critical to your conversion. But I think we all know that no amount of evidence is enough to convert anybody, and it's always going to be a matter of the heart. And I see you're nodding yes, so you agree with that premise. I would just like to hear your comments on experiences with this with your colleagues and such, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When I came to faith in Christ, it was really a two-stage process. The first was recognizing that a creator existed. And in retrospect, I would argue that the Holy Spirit was revealing that to me. I mean, there was obviously the scientific evidence at hand, and then it was after being convinced that there was a creator, having a pastor challenge me to read Scripture, which I was 23 years old and never had picked up the Bible. And so it was really reading the Gospel of Matthew, and specifically the Sermon on the Mount, where I encountered Christ through the pages of Scripture. So again, it was the Holy Spirit revealing Christ to me in the pages of Scripture. But at that time, this would have been in 1986. And at that time, Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize with Jim Watson and Maurice Wilkins for discovering the structure of DNA, had just written 2 books. One of them was called What Mad Pursuit, which is a story about the discovery of the DNA double helix. And then another book he wrote is called Life Itself, in which he looks at the origin of life question. And in both books, Crick reached the same conclusion I did as a graduate student. One was, in Life Itself, that there's no way to explain currently the origin of life. He basically said something to the effect that you would be forgiven if you thought that the origin of life was a miracle, so many of the things that would have had to have happened to get it going, right? So he reached the same conclusion I did when I looked at the intractable problems with the origin of life, that this really does look miraculous. In his book, What Mad Pursuit, he concludes the book by saying biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. And so there he's admitting that the first reaction that anybody has when they look at biochemical systems is it's designed. So he reached the same conclusions I did as a graduate school student. This is designed, and the origin of life just simply appears to be miraculous. I believe, by the grace of God, I was able to conclude that there's got to be a creator. Crick went to his grave as an outspoken atheist. So the question isn't what does the evidence show, but there are other factors at play, that I think involve psychological issues, issues of the will, issues of the heart, but I want to be cautious, about how I would characterize that, because I don't think we want to conclude that people who are scientists or people who push back on the evidence that we present are necessarily hard-hearted and lost causes. Sometimes when people push back, they're actually as much closer than you would think. And I think there are people who have been wounded by the church, and those wounds drive them to atheism. I think there are some people who are just intellectually convinced that there isn't a God. And again, I think those people can be reached if we're willing to engage them intellectually. But I think it's not a question of the evidence. It's a question of other things that are happening beyond the evidence itself, right?
Go on here. Although we may not understand all aspects of evolution, why does that mean that the miracle is God himself? Is it not logically possible that the miracle could be a different, perhaps non-creator scientific explanation?
Well, Fuzz just mentioned Crick. What he concluded was, well, it's not God, it's aliens from another planet that brought life here to planet Earth. But the question is that a sufficient explanation to explain the origin of life here on planet Earth? And, Crick passed away, but there are papers published just in the last year making the point, if there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, it's got to come after us, because the physics says we must be the first. And so the idea that they could travel across interstellar space and dump life here 3.8 billion years ago simply is not a viable explanation. But I think Crick is an example. There's no way I'm going to accept God. I got to find some other explanation. And the fact that he appealed to intelligent aliens on another planet, on a galaxy far, far away, tells me to the degree to which he was committed to reject the authority of God in his life.
And he had great faith, too, to believe that, I would have to say.
Pardon me?
I think he would have to have great faith, to believe aliens from another planet. Can I follow that up? I'm going to cheat because I get the mics. I think I get to cheat. You mentioned aliens. So just, can you give us the 3-minute talk on aliens that you have your experience with?
Sure. We actually got a book here on that, but not here. It's called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. Our publisher said we could have sold a lot more copies if we called it Little Green Women, but that's the way it goes. But really, it's based a lot on my experience overseas in addressing audiences where there's a lot more occultic activity going on. So, for example, when I was in the Soviet Union, when the communists were running the show, my audiences, often the majority, had close encounters with UFOs. And so they wanted me to speak on UFOs. But I noticed in many of my audiences, a large percentage of the people there, and we're talking people with degrees and PhDs in physics and chemistry and mathematics, etc., how many of them are manifesting the symptoms of being demon-possessed. And that was a time when the Soviet Union was sponsoring research in occult physics, trying to develop occult weapons to use against the West. But consequently, a lot of them are having these exposures with aliens. And what we write about in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men is that physical aliens like us, we have overwhelming evidence that we are alone in that capacity. They don't exist elsewhere in the universe. But the Bible speaks about God creating 2 distinct species of intelligent life: human beings that are constrained by the physics of the universe, and angels that are not constrained by the physics of the universe. As it tells us in Hebrews 13, many of us have had encounters with these angels, some with the righteous angels, others with the wicked angels. And we document that what's behind the UFO phenomena, and let me make a disclaimer here, 99% of what people report to me as UFOs here in the United States are not real UFOs. They're hoaxes, they're misidentified astronomical phenomena, they're optical illusions, but there's a residual that is the real thing. And the only people who have those experiences, what we call residual UFOs, are people that have deep involvement in the occult. And we end their book by saying, this is scientifically testable. If you will close the doors to the occult, that will be the end of your close encounters with UFOs. The demons will have no power over you. They can only come to you if you invite them to come. Take away the invitation, that'll be the end of that phenomena. But it explains why, for example, such a large percentage of Russians in the Soviet era were having these encounters and such a low percentage here in the United States. The level of occult activity here is much less. But for example, equatorial Brazil and France, it's still quite high. And if you go there, yeah, a lot of people will talk about these encounters with aliens. They're aliens not in our dimensions, they're aliens in other dimensions. Interestingly, 6 PhD physicists who are not theists have written about the UFO phenomena. Every one of them concludes that the only possible explanation is that they're aliens from another dimension. But that's the biblical definition of angels. They also all conclude that this is not benevolent, it's harmful. And when you have these encounters, the best you're going to escape with are recurring, terrifying nightmares. In the worst case, they kill you.
Dr. Ross, my name is Joe, and thanks to our PBS station here in St. Louis, they introduced me to dark energy. It was an incredible program that they put on, and are you aware of that program?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Is there anything that we can anticipate coming from your office or desk in regards to dark energy?
In regards to
Dark energy?
dark energy?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I just brought out the 4th edition of The Crater and the Cosmos a few months ago. And in that book, chapter 5 and 6, I talk about the latest advances in our knowledge about dark energy, how there are multiple independent observational demonstrations that establish that it really does exist. As I mentioned tonight, 25 independent observational demonstrations. We now have a measure that's quite accurate in how much dark energy there is. It's 70.7% of the total stuff of the universe. I'd say the strongest evidence for dark energy comes from the measure of the geometry of the universe. Anyway, check out chapter 5 and 6. I think the book is out there.
Okay, now I hear you're teasing women here about being green and things, and I'm the only one in line. There's plenty of us sitting around, so just be careful. I'm just telling you that.
Thank you.
I'm teasing. Okay. You know, we get to see the or the planets with a telescope and see their beauty and their detail. I'm a crier.
Pardon me?
I'm a crier, so just hang on.
What did you say about the planets?
How beautiful they are.
Oh, yeah, they're beautiful through
detail.
telescopes. Yeah.
With Job, how did he do it? I know it had to be with God. I mean, if we don't have a telescope to see the same beauty he saw?
Okay, very good question. I wrote a short article a few months ago on my Facebook page making the point that for the first time in human history, less than half of the world's population has ever seen the Milky Way. And that's because of our polluted skies. Both light pollution and air pollution prevent us from actually having the capacity to see those, unless you happen to live outside of a big city in a place that doesn't suffer from a lot of light pollution. When Job looked up at the sky with his naked eye, he could see 15,000 stars. Where Fuzz and I live in the Los Angeles basin, when we look up at the sky, we see 30 stars, not 15,000. And so Job could see the immensity of the Milky Way. And in fact, what you notice in ancient Egyptian astronomy, they actually tried to measure the parallax of the stars and discovered that they couldn't do it. And that's what led them to conclude those stars are objects just like the sun. Because with planets, they could measure their distances. They couldn't measure the distances of the stars. So then they knew all those thousands of stars they saw were objects just like the sun. So it gave them an idea just how majestic God's creation was. And in many respects, I would argue that people in the 21st century are more ignorant about science than people lived in the days of Job. One of the books I've written is called Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, where I make the point that people living in Job's day had intimate contact with wild birds and mammals. And the 12th chapter, Job says to his 3 friends, look to these birds, look to these mammals, they will teach you lessons. And what he meant was not just lessons of science, he meant spiritual lessons. As you have close contact with the animals, you notice that if they're not abused by your sin, they are actually attracted to you. They want to relate to you. They will come towards you. They want a relationship with you. But they only manifest that with a higher being. Likewise, these animals are designed to relate and serve and please a higher being. We humans are designed to serve and please and relate to a higher being. The book of Job ends by God saying to Job and his friends, you've been able to tame all these animals, but there's one animal you can't tame. You're not able to bring humility to a proud human heart. It takes a higher being to tame a human being, just like it takes a higher being to tame all these animals. And as your sin causes these animals to run away from you instead of towards you, it's your sin that causes you to run away from God or pretend he doesn't exist rather than run towards him to have an affectionate relationship with him. But notice today in the 21st century how few individuals in the human species have that kind of intimate contact with wild birds and wild mammals. especially intimate contact where sin is not a factor. It actually tells stories in Hidden Treasures in the book of Job of my encounters with those animals that I knew had no contact with human beings for over 50 years. And you could actually see how they were naturally designed to come and relate to a human being. I mean, I tell a story, for example, of how I woke up in the morning and inside my tent were all these animals wanting contact with me. I mean, that doesn't happen where they're afraid of you, but where they're not afraid of you, where they're not worried about being abused, they actually come towards us instead of running away from us. So yeah, Job had advantages we don't have.
Hi, my name is Tony. First of all, I want to say I'm kind of scared to ask my question now. And the
Hey,
reason
welcome
why-
to the club, man. We're all in the same boat.
Well, the reason why, first, I'm a believer. I solely believe in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And it's the reason I'm standing here today. If I had the time to go into my testimony, it would be probably rock people in this room. I'm still here breathing. But anyway, I argued with a friend of mine for years. We played chess together. And the possibility that God just didn't stop with humans as the final big product of the world, that maybe it was some other life He invented out there. And the reason why I asked myself that question, I'm not possessed. There's no demon in me. But this is because in my short life, seeing how technology went from the 70s to where it is today, and I mean, like, when I was a kid going to school, and I went to school and kids said, hey man, they made a plane can fly up in the sky and come back, go on Earth and come back and land. I was like, no, I bet the kid my lunch. And he ate my lunch that day. Because when I found out there was a space shuttle that really did that, it blew me away. But since then, the technology, like the video games, cell phones, all this technology is new. And then I watched a program where it showed where the microchip, where the thought of its invention came from alien technology, and that made me think. And then I thought, well, God can do anything, so what made me think that we the best of His creation? What if there's something else out there? And it's just a thought, and I wanted your thoughts on it. But
Well,
you answered that.
You know, that's such a good question. I've already written one book in attempting to answer that question. And I just got permission from the committee that Fuzz heads up to write a sequel to that book, and I actually got started on that this afternoon. So thank you, Fuzz. Thank you for your ideation team. And what we're doing in these two books is basically making the point that what's made our technology and incredible global advances possible is we happen to live in a unique era in the Earth's history where we got an optimal temperature for global human technology, and we have extreme climate stability. We've had that extreme climate stability for the past 9,000 years. But as I wrote in Improbable Planet, at a maximum, that's going to end in about 1,400 years. And we're going to return to a period of extreme climate instability, which will be the end of civilization as we know it. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is, according to the Bible, God's on a mission to take the human species from this creation to a brand new creation where the laws of physics are different. I mean, this world is not our home. We're just a passing through. And this new scientific evidence is telling us we're passing through at a relatively quick pace. We will be exiting to the new creation relatively shortly. But I'm now working on a sequel to Improbable Planet, where I'm actually talking about the discoveries of the past year that really give us specific details as to how much longer we can sustain our current technology and standard of living, and then what we need to do with that standard of living and technology to take the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ to all the people groups of the world. And that's why I'm so passionate about targeting these STEM people. I realize we need time. And it's going to take a mobilization of a lot of resources to get that job done in the time that I see remaining, thanks to what we see taking place in our understanding, what we call the Ice Age cycle. So if it's any comfort to you, our technology depends on ice. And the sun's never been brighter than it's been before. The fact that we got ice on planet Earth today is an outstanding miracle. And the fact that we got ice and climate stability is even a greater miracle. And God gave us that because indeed we are the epitome of his creation. As it tells us in the Bible, yes, right now we're less powerful than the angels, but a day will come when we will rule over the angels. We are the epitome of his creation. The angels watch the grace of God. We get to personally experience the grace of God. And because we experience the grace of God, we're being equipped and trained for a career, not just here on planet Earth, but in the new creation. And God's going to take us there relatively quickly.
Just going to interject so we all see the time. We're going to end at 9 p.m., so we have about 12 minutes, just so you know. And also, on your way out, we have refreshments for you to stick around, keep talking, dialogue, interact with some of their team out there, and look at their resources. I just want to interject that, so we got 12 minutes. Go ahead, Jamal.
Yeah, my question's about kangaroos. This is a serious question. This might be a curveball. But with Noah's Ark in mind, if the whole world was flooded, everything was on one boat, if that bad boy landed in one spot, how do kangaroos get to Australia? I mean, that continent's out in the middle of the water.
Yeah, good question. When it comes to Noah's flood, you don't want to just read Genesis 6, 7, and 8. You want to read the Psalms, Job, Proverbs, 2 Peter. Those are just a few of the biblical texts that address the flood of Noah. And so you need to integrate all those texts. I mean, kind of our interpretive model. Take the Bible literally and consistently, but you need to read all the biblical data. What you'll see in 2 Peter 2, verse 5, is that the world of the ungodly was flooded. So as far as ungodly people existed, that world was flooded. What you see in 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6, is the world at the time the event took place was flooded. The Greek term is cosmos tote. But you notice in both 2 Peter 2 and 2 Peter 3, Peter qualifies the word cosmos with an adjective. Now, if he meant the entire planet, there would be no adjective in either case. The fact that it was qualified tells us it's the world of humanity, not necessarily the entire globe. Now, what you see in Job, Psalms, and Proverbs are creation chapters that deal with the subject of Genesis 1. And they all address creation day 3. In fact, I just mentioned here a few minutes ago the new evidence that we have that Genesis 1 got it right on the continental land masses. But what you see, for example, in Psalm 104 is that there comes a time when God transforms our planet Earth from a water world into a world with oceans and continents coexisting. What it says in verse 9 is that once the continents are in place, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. That's repeated in Job. It's repeated in Job 38, in Job 38, Proverbs 8, and 3 texts in the book of the Psalms, which means that the flood of Noah couldn't have covered the entire surface of planet Earth. It's explicitly ruled out in those texts. Now, here's an interesting response I get from my friends who are leaders of young Earth creationist organizations. They say, Hugh, you're appealing to the New Testament and you're appealing to these poetry texts. And they say, poetry is an inferior communication than the narrative of Genesis 1. But that's not what I learned in seminary. What I learned in seminary is that that Hebrew poetry is a powerful tool for communicating didactic truth, and that we're to interpret the narrative texts of the Bible in light of the didactic texts. And didactic means teaching texts. And that some of those texts are poetry and some of them are prose. But in terms of this idea that somehow the poetry books of the Bible are inferior, notice that our most explicit teaching and extensive teaching on the doctrine of the Trinity is in the poetry of Isaiah. So I think it's a mistake to demean the poetry that's in the Old Testament. And I understand it. I mean, English poetry doesn't have the power of Hebrew poetry to communicate didactic truth. But yeah, talk to anybody who's been exposed to Hebrew, they'll tell you it's a very powerful medium for communicating didactic truth. which means we don't have to worry about, I'll tell you this one. I was once at a meeting with a whole bunch of global flood theologians, and at one point they said, Hugh, we want you to give the strongest evidence that you know of that the flood had to be global. And I said, well, I'm from the Los Angeles area. One of the suburbs of Los Angeles next to the LA airport is Torrance. And the text says the rain came down in Torrance. So I guess that must be the strongest evidence that the flood indeed was global. But the whole point is, the Bible makes it quite clear. Yes, it wiped out the entire world of humanity, but notice humanity did not become global until Genesis 10 and 11. Before Genesis 10 and 11, humanity was in one locale. In fact, what you see in Genesis 11, God judging humanity for their failure to fill the earth. And so God had to forcibly scatter humanity over the face of the earth.
Good. Here's one. I learned in graduate school that all of life's DNA is 99% similar. Is this true, and do you think it disproves your theory?
You know, one of the pieces of evidence that people often point to as evidence for evolution is biological similarity among organisms, and that would include similarity in the genetic makeup of humans and the great apes. So, for example, the claim is that there's a 99% similarity between humans and chimpanzees. But you could understand that similarity as reflecting not common evolutionary ancestry, but actually common design. That is, that a creator would have employed the same design elements to create all life on Earth. And in fact, when you look at biochemistry, there's a universal nature to biochemistry. All life on Earth is made up of the same types of biochemical systems. All life on Earth is made up of cells. All life on Earth is made up of similar anatomical and physiological systems. And in fact, again, I would see that as evidence for common design, not common descent. When you look at Genesis 2, it talks about the creation of Adam as being made from the dust of the earth and God breathing the breath of life into him. Well, it's interesting because in Genesis 2:19 it talks about the creation of the animals, the beasts in the field, the birds in the air from the dust of the earth. But they do not receive the divine breath. Only Adam receives the divine breath, which I would argue is the image of God in that text. But what's interesting is it's telling us that we are made out of the same stuff as other animals are. And if that's the case, then you would expect that we would share the same molecular components as part of a makeup, but also the same design templates would be used to create us. So I think the Bible actually anticipates this idea that we would have anatomical, physiological, biochemical, and genetic similarities to other creatures. Now, I've had atheists challenge me saying, well, if God is this all-powerful, limitless creator, then why would he use the same set of designs to make all life on Earth? Why not use a wide variety of designs? And I think the answer to that in part is that by creating life with the same designs, it actually makes biology possible. That is, if every organism was made with a distinct design, then the discipline of biology is impossible. The fact that all life on Earth has the same designs means that we can study, for example, a yeast cell, and from studying a yeast cell, we can actually learn about human biochemistry. And this allows for drug development. It allows for medicine to even be possible. And so I think that the shared designs that we see is essentially making God known to us through the life sciences. That because of biology, we can understand the living realm. We see God's handiwork. We see God's fingerprint in the creation. But also as part of God's providence, that because of the shared designs, it's possible for us to understand life sufficiently that we can then use it for our advantage And again, it even makes the whole idea of medicine possible, because the experiments we need to do to understand biology, to develop medicines, to test medicines are only possible because we share similarity with chimps and with other mammals.
Yeah, I mean, you would say that 1% difference is still a huge difference.
Yes. Yep.
Yes, good evening. It's very interesting, very technical. My question is, I think Einstein said that either everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle. And isn't life, all life forms, a total miracle, very complex? Someone recently, I didn't see the movie, but he made a documentary on just the flight of a bird, just any bird. And he showed that so many complex things have to happen at exactly the right time for that bird to fly. I mean, what do you say to the atheist? I mean, when you look at all life forms, it's highly complex. It's nearly impossibly complex.
Well, what you're going to see in our website is lots of articles that Fuzz and I have written making the point that a lot of our technological advances has been copying the designs we see in organisms here on Earth. So it's more evidence that God can do it better than we can do it. And as Fuzz points out in his book, Creating Life in the Lab, if the atheists think it's that easy to happen, then why can't they make it in the lab? So, Fuzz, you want to add anything?
No, since we're running out of time, that was good.
This will be our last question right here.
Thank you both for doing this. I really enjoy hearing you. My question is not so much about the Bible, but about your science. I see you both as modernist scientists, and what I mean by that is you've separated out the observer from the observed. And I would suspect that both of you look at me and you think, he's out there. I would argue that I'm actually on the back of your retina as a vision. I think you probably hear me and think that I'm out here. And I would argue that actually what you hear is your inner ear mechanism. And so, even when we use telescopes to look out into the universe, that's still up against our retina when we look through that telescope, and it's still being processed by our neurological system. So here's my question. Have you considered that that your science and your conclusions are as much about you as an observer as it is about what you observe?
Yeah, I think I get the question. And it's not just our brain and our retina and physical senses. We can use non-organic detectors, and they see the same thing our eyes and ears see. So it doesn't necessarily depend on our biology to detect the event. But it still raises a question. Maybe all of reality is some kind of computer simulation. I get that kind of question on Twitter and Facebook all the time. And incidentally, both Fuzz and I answer questions on Facebook and Twitter. So if you go home tonight and think of a great question, you can still ask us that question. And I would say this, I cannot rule out with absolute certainty that what we're seeing all around us, including you yourself, is just some complex computer simulation set up by some kind of being beyond the universe to fool all of us into thinking we're actually making contact with physical reality. That is a possibility. But I put it in the same realm of possibility that my wife of 41 years doesn't really exist. I can't give you absolute proof that she exists. On the other hand, I have a lot of experimental and observational evidence that she exists. Moreover, that evidence gets stronger with every year that I'm married to her. And that's kind of the same way our science works. The evidence, I think, overwhelmingly supports the conclusion we are in touch with physical reality, and that evidence gets stronger with every day that goes by. And so, yeah, I can't eliminate in an absolute sense the computer simulation hypothesis, but I can draw the conclusion that it's an extremely tiny probability that gets tinier and tinier every day that goes by. But it was Kurt Gödel who made the point. Because we humans are constrained to the space-time dimensions of the universe, we can never learn everything about the universe. There's always some point of ignorance, and the point of ignorance will allow speculation, which is why I believe we'll always have atheist scientists. But what I notice about my atheist scientist peers, they're being backed into a corner that's smaller and smaller and smaller as we learn more and more about science. And many of them are realizing they're being backed into a smaller corner and are actually coming to the Christian faith. And we've seen many atheist scientists finally admit that there's a God out there and give their lives to Jesus Christ, including even a Nobel laureate.
Amen.